The Atlantic Ocean during World War II was a vast, treacherous battlefield where danger lurked not only in the depths but in the skies above. Long before most Americans understood the scale of the conflict, merchant ships had begun sailing in convoys, carrying vital supplies from the United States to Britain and the Soviet Union. These unassuming vessels, loaded with food, munitions, tanks, and raw materials, became the lifeline of the Allied war effort. Each departure carried immense stakes, for every ship that reached its destination meant another step toward sustaining armies and nations at war. The crews, often civilians pressed into service, faced icy waters, unpredictable storms, and the constant threat of German U-boats lurking beneath the waves. Convoys moved with deliberate, coordinated precision, designed to minimize losses in an ocean dominated by stealth and surprise. Merchant ships sailed under the protection of warships, forming a moving fortress across thousands of miles of open sea. Captains and officers relied on navigation charts, signal codes, and constant vigilance, knowing that a single miscalculation could draw the attention of the Kriegsmarine's submarines. In the shadow of these silent predators, the Atlantic became a theater of tension and terror, where the slightest mistake could trigger disaster. Each voyage demanded skill, endurance, and unwavering courage from crews who were ordinary men thrown into extraordinary circumstances. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of attrition and strategy, a contest not only of weapons but of endurance and resourcefulness. German U-boats, equipped with torpedoes and advanced detection methods, sought to disrupt supply lines that were critical to Britain's survival. Convoys adopted zigzag courses, blackout measures, and deceptive signals to confuse enemy submarines. Merchant sailors learned to detect periscopes, interpret sonar pings, and respond to sudden alerts with split-second decisions. The ocean was an arena where human skill and instinct met mechanical innovation, and each convoy became a high-stakes experiment in survival under extreme pressure. Despite their civilian status, merchant crews became soldiers at sea, their ships both cargo carriers and battlegrounds. Many had no formal combat training, yet they manned guns, repaired damage from air raids, and navigated storm-tossed waters with unwavering resolve. Convoys were not only logistical missions, they were acts of defiance against the Axis powers, demonstrating that supply and survival were as critical to victory as battlefield maneuvers. The courage of these men, often overlooked in traditional histories, was a cornerstone of Allied endurance, proving that heroism existed far from the front lines in the rhythm of engine rooms and lookout posts. Escort ships, including destroyers and corvettes, became lifelines for merchant vessels. These naval ships patrolled the flanks of convoys, hunting submarines and providing early warning against surface and aerial attacks. Coordination between merchant captains and naval officers was essential, as the slightest miscommunication could leave a ship exposed to enemy torpedoes. Radar, sonar, and depth charges became vital tools in this underwater chess game. Yet technology alone could not substitute for human vigilance and bravery. The Atlantic convoys demanded constant attention, teamwork, and adaptability, where one misstep could endanger hundreds of lives. The ocean itself was a formidable adversary, indifferent to human plans and ambitions. Hurricanes, freezing temperatures, and treacherous waves tested the endurance of crews, breaking both bodies and spirits. Ice would form on decks and rigging, adding weight that threatened to capsize vessels, while gale-force winds tested the limits of every hull and engine. The psychological strain of months at sea, combined with the threat of enemy attack, created a pressure cooker of fear, exhaustion, and determination. Merchant sailors were trained in navigation and cargo handling, but they became masters of survival, adapting to a hostile environment with resilience and ingenuity. Communication was both vital and perilous. Convoys relied on coded messages, signal flags, and radio transmissions to maintain formation and coordinate with escort vessels. German intelligence and submarines constantly sought to intercept these communications, turning every message into a potential risk. Silence was often necessary, yet coordination could not be sacrificed. This delicate balance between staying informed and remaining undetected was a constant tension, requiring discipline, trust, and split-second judgment. The Atlantic convoys were as much a battle of information as of firepower, with survival dependent on clarity, timing, and secrecy. The success of these convoys was measured not in dramatic battles, but in the simple act of arrival. Each ship that reached a British port, laden with supplies, represented countless lives saved and countless more sustained on the front lines. The courage of ordinary sailors navigating extraordinary dangers underpinned the Allied war effort, providing the material lifeblood that armies and civilians alike depended upon. In the vast expanse of the Atlantic, far from headlines and fanfare, men and ships engaged in a relentless struggle, proving that the war for survival and supply could be fought as fiercely as any land campaign, and that the sea itself had become a battlefield where every mile gained mattered profoundly. The organization of the convoys was a monumental logistical achievement, coordinating hundreds of ships across the treacherous North Atlantic. Every vessel, from small freighters to massive tankers, had a designated position within the formation, moving in strict rhythm with naval escorts. The planning required meticulous attention to weather patterns, U-boat intelligence, and port schedules. Convoy commanders balanced speed, protection, and endurance, knowing that a single misstep could scatter ships and leave them vulnerable to enemy attack. Each voyage became a high-stakes experiment in coordination, where strategy and human endurance intertwined against the unforgiving sea. Merchant sailors came from diverse backgrounds: farmers, clerks, dockworkers, and even retired mariners drawn back into service. Many had little to no combat experience, yet they quickly adapted to the rigors of convoy duty. They manned guns, watched for periscopes, and learned to navigate storms with precision. Their courage was forged not in celebrated battles, but in the relentless monotony of the sea, punctuated by sudden bursts of terror when torpedoes struck or ships exploded. These ordinary men became extraordinary, their resilience sustaining vital supply lines that allowed Allied forces to continue fighting across Europe and North Africa. The German U-boat threat was relentless and technologically sophisticated. Submarines patrolled known convoy routes, using stealth, speed, and coordinated wolf-pack tactics to attack en masse. Merchant vessels relied on evasive maneuvers, zigzagging courses, and blackout protocols to reduce visibility at night. Every moment demanded vigilance. A single torpedo could destroy a ship and endanger the convoy's cohesion. Radar, sonar, and depth charges were vital, but ultimately survival depended on human skill, alertness, and the ability to respond instinctively to emerging threats. The Atlantic had become a deadly theater where human ingenuity was pitted against mechanical precision. Escort ships formed a protective shield around convoys, their crews constantly scanning for enemy activity. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates hunted submarines using sonar and depth charges, while providing guidance and support for merchant captains. The relationship between the escorts and the convoy was symbiotic. Success depended on constant communication, discipline, and trust. A single lapse in coordination could allow a U-boat to penetrate the formation, with devastating consequences. These engagements were not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but intense in their immediacy, combining strategy, technical skill, and human courage in the unforgiving expanse of the ocean. Weather added another layer of peril. Storms, ice, and freezing temperatures transformed the Atlantic into a merciless adversary. Decks became slippery with ice, cargo shifted in violent seas, and engines strained to maintain formation against relentless waves. The physical toll on sailors was immense, compounded by sleepless nights and the constant psychological stress of enemy threat. Survival required endurance, improvisation, and sheer willpower, turning each convoy into a test of human resilience against both nature and war. The ocean itself was an opponent, demanding as much attention and respect as any U-boat lurking beneath the waves. Communication within the convoy was a delicate balance. Signals had to be precise yet discreet, ensuring that the formation remained coordinated while avoiding detection. Radio silence was often enforced, forcing captains to rely on flags, lights, and prearranged codes. Miscommunication could scatter the convoy or lead ships directly into danger. The tension of maintaining contact while evading enemy intelligence created a constant pressure, sharpening the instincts of sailors and officers alike. The success of a convoy often depended less on firepower and more on disciplined coordination and shared trust. Each convoy carried cargo that was critical to the survival of nations. Food, munitions, tanks, fuel, and medical supplies flowed across the Atlantic, sustaining armies and civilians alike. Losses were catastrophic. The sinking of a single freighter could delay operations, starve troops, or imperil entire campaigns. Sailors understood that their mission was not just transport. It was the lifeblood of the Allied war effort. Every ship that arrived safely strengthened the front lines, proving that endurance, vigilance, and bravery in the Atlantic were as consequential as any battle on land or in the air. The success of the convoy system was a testament to human perseverance, technological innovation, and strategic foresight. Despite the omnipresent threat of U-boats and the relentless challenges of the ocean, merchant ships continued to sail, connecting continents and sustaining the fight against tyranny. Each journey was a story of courage, coordination, and survival, where ordinary men became guardians of global destiny. In the hidden battles of the Atlantic, where silence, secrecy, and endurance determined outcomes, the fate of nations depended on the steadfast crews who braved waves, storms, and torpedoes, ensuring that hope and supplies reached those who needed them most. The human cost of the Atlantic convoys was staggering, yet largely invisible to the world beyond the ports. Sailors faced frostbite, exhaustion, and malnutrition, often living in cramped, damp quarters with little respite from the bitter cold. Many endured weeks at sea without seeing land. Their only companions the groaning of engines, the slap of waves against hulls, and the distant echo of depth charges. Despite these hardships, morale was maintained through camaraderie, shared purpose, and the knowledge that each successful voyage sustained the fight against fascism. Ordinary men became guardians of civilization, navigating a theater where survival was as much a battle of endurance as of strategy. The threat from German submarines never relented. Wolfpack tactics, coordinated groups of U-boats attacking simultaneously, tested the limits of convoy defenses. Merchant sailors and naval escorts had to anticipate patterns, respond quickly, and sometimes sacrifice one ship to save the formation. Night attacks were especially perilous, with the Black Atlantic concealing periscopes and torpedo trails. Crews learned to interpret subtle signs in the water and sky, relying on instinct honed by months of vigilance. Each engagement was a deadly dance of patience, precision, and courage, where the slightest error could mean the difference between life and death. Escort ships bore the brunt of these confrontations, often engaging directly with enemy submarines to protect the convoy. Destroyers and corvettes performed daring maneuvers, dropping depth charges and attempting to flush U-boats from hiding. The coordination between escorts and merchant vessels was critical. The success of a convoy often hinged on the ability of naval forces to neutralize threats while maintaining formation. The tension aboard each ship was palpable, with sailors balancing fear and duty as torpedoes streaked through the water, explosions rocked the hull, and the cold Atlantic threatened to claim the unwary. Storms and icy waters compounded the peril. The North Atlantic was notorious for sudden gales and massive waves that could sweep men overboard or crush lifeboats. Cargo shifted dangerously in holds. Engines strained under constant load, and hulls creaked under the relentless pressure of the sea. In these moments, the ocean itself became a formidable adversary, indifferent to human courage. Survival depended on skill, quick thinking, and cooperation among the crew, with every member, from the captain to the youngest deckhand, playing a critical role in maintaining both ship and convoy integrity. Communication was a lifeline and a gamble. Radio silence was often enforced to avoid detection, leaving captains reliant on signal flags, lights, and prearranged codes. The slightest misinterpretation could scatter the convoy or place a ship directly in the path of a lurking U-boat. Coordination required trust, discipline, and unwavering focus, as the Atlantic could claim the unwary in an instant. Even a brief lapse in vigilance might result in catastrophe, highlighting the psychological as well as physical demands placed upon the crews navigating these secret convoys. Despite the omnipresent danger, the morale of merchant sailors was fortified by the knowledge that their mission mattered. Every ton of food, fuel, or ammunition delivered directly influenced the outcome of battles in Europe and North Africa. Ships that arrived intact meant lives saved, offensives sustained, and nations kept in the fight. This awareness imbued crews with a sense of purpose that transcended fear, turning ordinary men into essential actors on a global stage. Heroism was measured not only by combat engagement, but by the successful completion of these perilous journeys. The convoy system evolved continuously, incorporating intelligence, technology, and experience. Allied forces developed better routing strategies, improved sonar and radar systems, and coordinated air cover to protect vulnerable vessels. Lessons learned from previous losses informed future operations, creating a dynamic system that balanced risk with necessity. Each voyage became a test of innovation and endurance, where the merging of human ingenuity and mechanical precision could mean the survival of both ship and crew. The Atlantic convoys became an emblem of resilience, a testament to the power of coordination under extreme duress. By the end of the war, the story of the Atlantic convoys had become a saga of courage and sacrifice largely unknown to the public. Thousands of merchant sailors had risked and often given their lives, ensuring that Britain remained supplied, that Soviet forces received critical materials, and that the Allied war machine continued to turn. These secret convoys demonstrated that victory relied not only on battles fought on land and in the air, but also on the steadfast endurance of civilians and naval crews braving one of the deadliest theaters of the war. In the silence of the Atlantic, where waves and wind masked both danger and heroism, the fate of nations rested on the courage of those who sailed onward, through storm and darkness, toward hope and survival. The courage displayed on the Atlantic convoys was matched by ingenuity and adaptation. Crews quickly learned to repair damage from near misses, patch leaks in freezing waters, and maintain engines under constant strain. Ship captains devised evasive maneuvers, altering courses unpredictably to confuse U-boats while maintaining formation integrity. Every decision carried weight, for a single error could imperil the convoy and doom hundreds of tons of vital supplies. The relentless training of instinct and improvisation transformed ordinary sailors into resilient tacticians, capable of navigating both human and natural threats with skill and precision. The human element of the convoys was deeply complex. Sailors faced fear not only of enemy attack, but of isolation, fatigue, and psychological strain. Months at sea, often with minimal sleep and limited rations, tested morale and resolve. Crews formed tight-knit communities, relying on shared labor, humor, and rituals to sustain spirits. Officers and captains became leaders not only in strategy, but in maintaining cohesion, mediating disputes, and fostering trust. The bonds formed in these crucibles of danger were essential for survival, proving that human resilience could be as decisive as firepower in the unforgiving Atlantic theater. Escort vessels performed both defensive and offensive roles, balancing protection with aggression. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates conducted depth charge attacks on detected submarines while guiding merchant ships through treacherous waters. Coordination required constant vigilance, with sonar operators, gunners, and captains communicating rapidly to respond to shifting threats. In the dark Atlantic nights, the smallest misstep, a misread sonar ping or delayed signal, could allow a U-boat to strike. Every engagement was a high-stakes gamble, blending technology, skill, and human intuition in a deadly underwater chess game. Weather remained an omnipresent adversary. Snow, sleet, and waves towering higher than the decks tested both human and mechanical limits. Cargo shifted violently, threatening to capsize vessels, while rigging iced over and engines strained under constant pressure. The combination of storm and enemy presence created an almost unendurable environment. Sailors became adept at multitasking under extreme conditions, navigating, repairing, and standing watch simultaneously. Survival required adaptability, coordination, and endurance, turning the Atlantic into a proving ground for human ingenuity and determination. Communication was both a lifeline and a vulnerability. Convoys relied on flags, lights, and prearranged signals to maintain formation while avoiding interception. Radio silence prevented enemy eavesdropping but heightened the need for precision and trust. Even minor errors could scatter ships or expose them to attack. Captains learned to read subtle cues, anticipate signals, and act decisively in moments of ambiguity. The delicate balance between staying informed and remaining undetected defined every voyage, highlighting the psychological strain that accompanied the physical dangers of the open sea. The success of each convoy relied on the meticulous balance of timing, protection, and speed. Routes were calculated to minimize exposure to known U-boat positions, while coordination with naval intelligence and aerial reconnaissance offered additional layers of security. Every ship's position, course, and speed were carefully orchestrated to ensure the maximum chance of survival. The effectiveness of this system was a testament to careful planning, human vigilance, and adaptability under extreme pressure, illustrating how even in total war, methodical organization could save lives and sustain the fight. Cargo carried on these ships was the lifeblood of nations at war. Food, fuel, munitions, medical supplies, and vehicles sustained armies and civilians alike, influencing the outcome of campaigns from North Africa to Northern Europe. Losses were devastating. Each sunken ship represented disrupted offensives, delayed relief, and human suffering. Sailors understood the stakes implicitly, knowing that their vigilance, skill, and endurance directly affected the survival of thousands. The quiet heroism of these men, facing invisible threats and relentless waves, was as critical to victory as any frontline assault. By the mid-war years, the Atlantic convoy system had become a highly refined mechanism of survival and strategy. Adaptation, coordination, and endurance defined every voyage, creating a continuous cycle of risk, vigilance, and reward. Merchant sailors, naval escorts, and support crews operated in unison, often unseen and uncelebrated, yet their efforts sustained the Allied war effort. In the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic, these secret convoys exemplified the extraordinary courage of ordinary people, proving that the war for survival, supply, and ultimately victory was waged as fiercely at sea as it was on land and in the air. The psychological toll of the Atlantic convoys was immense, yet the crews pressed onward with grim determination. Sailors faced a constant tension between fear and duty, navigating a vast expanse where enemy submarines could strike without warning. Each day demanded heightened awareness, with lookouts scanning for periscopes and splashes, and engine crews maintaining speed under exhausting conditions. Sleep was scarce, meals were hurried, and the monotony of endless waves amplified anxiety. Yet amid this strain, camaraderie and shared purpose forged unbreakable bonds, transforming fear into a collective resolve that fueled survival and mission success. Tactical innovation became essential in countering the U-boat menace. Convoys adopted zigzag patterns to make targeting more difficult, while escorts developed coordinated depth charge patterns to flush submarines from hiding. Air cover from coastal bases extended the reach of convoys, and intelligence from decrypted Enigma messages provided strategic advantage. Each convoy voyage became a dynamic operation, requiring real-time adaptation to evolving threats. Merchant sailors, often civilians, became adept at reading the sea and sky, integrating their instincts with technological tools to evade unseen predators. The human stories aboard these ships reveal both heroism and tragedy. Men worked through blizzards, repaired damaged hulls under enemy fire, and rescued comrades from icy waters. In some cases, acts of extraordinary courage, boarding sinking vessels to salvage cargo, manning exposed guns under attack, or navigating treacherous storms, defined the success of entire missions. These moments, often unnoticed in broader military histories, were vital threads in the fabric of Allied resilience. They highlight the convergence of ordinary labor and extraordinary valor that characterized the merchant service during the war. Naval escorts, from nimble corvettes to heavily armed destroyers, became lifelines in the Atlantic. Their crews were trained to detect, pursue, and neutralize submarine threats while guiding fragile merchant vessels through dangerous waters. These ships engaged in relentless patrols, braving storms and enemy torpedoes alike, sustaining a shield around convoys that was both physical and psychological. Sailors aboard the escorts developed a keen sense of timing and intuition, anticipating enemy maneuvers and responding with precision. The relationship between escorts and merchant vessels was symbiotic, relying on trust, coordination, and shared courage. The convoys were a testament to industrial and logistical coordination. Ships departed in synchronized schedules, optimized for the safest routes, taking into account weather patterns and known U-boat positions. Ports were buzzing centers of preparation, with crews loading cargo, checking engines, and coordinating with naval authorities. Every detail, from ballast adjustments to gun placement, was scrutinized for efficiency and safety. This meticulous planning underscored the strategic importance of the Atlantic supply lines. The war effort depended on the safe passage of these vessels, and every successful crossing bolstered the Allies' capacity to wage war across multiple continents. Environmental hazards were as lethal as enemy fire. North Atlantic storms could batter ships for days, with freezing rain, massive waves, and hidden ice floes testing the limits of both vessels and men. The sheer force of nature could incapacitate engines, shift cargo, or sweep crew members overboard. Surviving these elements required not only skill but also psychological fortitude, as sailors confronted their mortality and the indifference of the sea. In these moments, the human capacity for endurance and improvisation was as critical as any strategic maneuver, turning the ocean itself into a formidable adversary. Each successful convoy reinforced the strategic and moral significance of the merchant service. Cargo that reached Europe sustained armies, protected civilians, and enabled the execution of complex military operations. These achievements were often overshadowed by dramatic battles on land or in the air, yet their impact was profound. The Atlantic convoys demonstrated that victory depended not only on tanks and guns, but on the courage, skill, and perseverance of ordinary people navigating extraordinary danger. Each ship that reached port intact was a triumph of endurance, coordination, and collective will. By 1943, the Atlantic convoy system had become a finely tuned instrument of war. Lessons learned from early losses informed new tactics, technology, and training, dramatically improving survival rates. Merchant sailors, naval escorts, and support crews operated with extraordinary discipline, their efforts underpinning the success of Allied campaigns in Europe and North Africa. The secret convoys proved that the war was fought on multiple fronts, and that courage in the face of unseen threats, coordination under pressure, and unyielding perseverance could tip the balance of global conflict. In the relentless expanse of the Atlantic, the fate of nations rested upon the steadfast determination of those who dared to sail onward. By 1943, the stakes in the Atlantic had grown higher than ever. The Germans intensified their U-boat campaigns, deploying new tactics, improved submarines, and extended wolf-pack formations to cut off Allied supply lines. Convoys faced more concentrated attacks, often navigating minefields, aerial reconnaissance, and sudden night assaults. The challenge was not only to survive, but to maintain the flow of vital materials that fueled armies and civilians alike. Merchant crews and naval escorts were now seasoned veterans, yet every crossing remained unpredictable, demanding vigilance, courage, and unwavering resolve. Technology and intelligence became pivotal in this brutal theater. Allied cryptographers had begun decoding German Enigma communications, allowing convoys to reroute around known U-boat concentrations. Radar, sonar, and depth charge improvements gave escorts a fighting chance to detect and neutralize submarines before they could strike. Yet despite these advances, human skill remained indispensable. Officers had to interpret signals, make split-second decisions, and manage chaos when attack struck. The combination of intellect, experience, and courage defined the new era of Atlantic warfare, where survival depended on a delicate interplay between man and machine. The psychological strain on sailors reached its peak during intense engagements. Hours stretched into days under constant threat, with torpedoes whistling through the water, explosions rocking ships, and lookouts scanning endlessly for periscopes. Fear was omnipresent, but so was determination. Crews relied on training, camaraderie, and shared purpose to maintain focus. Those who survived learned to act instinctively, balancing caution with boldness. Every maneuver, from evasive zigzags to damage control, was executed under extreme duress, a testament to human resilience against both enemy and nature. Storms continued to test the limits of the convoys. North Atlantic gales and freezing seas created conditions as deadly as any submarine. Cargo shifted violently, threatening to capsize ships, while ice coated decks and rigging, adding danger to every movement. Sailors faced both the physical challenge of maintaining their vessels and the mental challenge of enduring isolation and exposure. Survival depended on adaptability, endurance, and teamwork, with every member of the crew contributing to the vessel's resilience. Nature and war collided in this unforgiving environment, shaping the character and skill of those who sailed these secret lifelines. Naval escorts were the lifeblood of the convoys, their vigilance often determining survival. Corvettes, destroyers, and frigates patrolled the flanks, scanning with sonar, deploying depth charges, and intercepting enemy signals. Coordination with merchant captains was critical, as a misstep could expose a vulnerable ship to deadly attack. These engagements were tense, continuous, and exhausting, blending technology with human intuition. The presence of escorts instilled confidence and discipline in merchant crews, forging a symbiotic relationship in which courage, trust, and strategy ensured the continuity of life-saving convoys. The cargo aboard each convoy carried strategic weight. Weapons, fuel, and medical supplies enabled Allied offensives across multiple theaters. Food and materials sustained civilians in Britain and the Soviet Union, preventing starvation and maintaining morale. Each successful delivery was a silent victory, achieved not through headline battles, but through endurance, precision, and teamwork. The Atlantic convoys demonstrated that war was as much about logistics, resourcefulness, and persistence as it was about tanks, aircraft, or soldiers in combat. The survival of nations often hinged on these unheralded crossings. Casualties were inevitable, and losses were a sobering reality. Torpedoed ships, violent storms, and mechanical failures claimed lives despite precautions. Sailors faced the ultimate test of courage as they rescued comrades from freezing waters or abandoned sinking vessels. The human cost was profound, and yet the spirit of the convoys endured. These sacrifices underscored the gravity of the mission and the courage required to undertake it. Heroism was measured not only in battle victories, but in the steadfast commitment to duty under conditions of extreme danger and uncertainty. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic convoy system had become a refined, resilient network that balanced risk, intelligence, and human endurance. Merchant sailors and naval escorts, working in concert, had transformed a perilous stretch of ocean into a lifeline for Allied forces. Their courage, skill, and perseverance ensured the delivery of essential supplies, enabling offensives that would turn the tide of the war. In the hidden struggle beneath waves and storms, ordinary men achieved extraordinary feats, proving that the Atlantic convoys were as critical to Allied victory as any battle fought on land or in the air. 1944 marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, as the Allied powers gained momentum through improved tactics, technological innovation, and sheer determination. Convoy strategies had evolved into highly coordinated operations, integrating intelligence from decrypted German communications with air and naval support. Long-range aircraft now patrolled previously unreachable sectors, forcing U-boats to operate with caution. Merchant ships, once vulnerable, moved with greater confidence, though danger remained omnipresent. The Atlantic, though still unforgiving, had become a theater where skill, preparation, and endurance increasingly offset the threat of enemy action. Crew experience played a crucial role in survival. Many merchant sailors had endured multiple crossings, facing storms, torpedoes, and near disasters. Their knowledge of ship handling, damage control, and tactical maneuvering became invaluable. New recruits learned under their guidance, absorbing lessons forged in fear and adversity. Every convoy became a classroom at sea, teaching men to react instinctively to threats, coordinate with escorts, and maintain both vessel and cargo under extreme pressure. Experience transformed ordinary men into expert navigators of peril, capable of facing both enemy and nature with measured resolve. The psychological resilience of the crews was tested like never before. Months at sea, the monotony of waves, the ever-present threat of torpedoes, and the bitter cold created conditions of constant stress. Sleep was sporadic, meals were frugal, and the noise of engines and the sea never ceased. Yet camaraderie, humor, and shared rituals helped sustain morale. Letters from home, brief port stops, and moments of quiet reflection reminded sailors of the stakes beyond the ocean, reinforcing the purpose behind their courage. The human spirit endured alongside the mechanical engines of war, forming an unbreakable backbone of the Allied supply line. Escort ships had become formidable tools of defense. Destroyers and corvettes operated with coordination and precision, employing sonar, radar, and depth charges with deadly effect. They were constantly alert, scanning for the faintest sign of a lurking U-boat. Night operations were particularly tense, requiring silent coordination and immediate response to even subtle threats. These vessels acted as both shield and spear, defending the convoy while actively seeking to eliminate enemy submarines. The skill of their crews ensured that merchant ships could complete their missions, proving that coordination and vigilance were as decisive as firepower in maintaining the lifeline across the Atlantic. Weather continued to challenge every crossing. Gale force winds and freezing temperatures tested the limits of ships and men alike. Ice accumulated on decks and rigging, cargo shifted violently, and engine rooms strained under constant stress. Storms could scatter ships, damage hulls, and endanger lives without warning. Sailors became adept at reading the sky and sea, predicting shifts in weather, and taking proactive measures to safeguard the convoy. Nature remained an ever-present adversary, demanding respect, skill, and endurance from all who sailed these vital routes. Communication remained a delicate and vital art. Convoys relied on coded signals, semaphore, and precise coordination with escort ships. Radio silence often prevented transmission, forcing reliance on prearranged plans and visual cues. Every signal had to be interpreted accurately, every maneuver executed precisely. Miscommunication could expose a ship to attack, compromise the convoy, or result in disaster. Trust and discipline were paramount, as sailors depended on one another to maintain formation, respond to threats, and safeguard both cargo and lives across thousands of miles of unforgiving ocean. The cargo aboard each ship was more than supplies. It was hope and survival for nations under siege. Food, munitions, fuel, and vehicles allowed armies to fight, civilians to endure, and governments to maintain stability. The loss of a single ship could have cascading consequences, delaying operations, starving troops, or disrupting civilian life. Sailors understood the enormity of their responsibility, knowing that their courage and diligence directly influenced the broader war effort. Each successful crossing became a quiet but essential victory, a testament to endurance, strategy, and human resolve. By the close of 1944, the Atlantic convoys had achieved a remarkable resilience. They had evolved into a system where human skill, technological innovation, and strategic planning converged to overcome relentless threats. Merchant sailors, naval escorts, and support personnel demonstrated extraordinary endurance and courage, sustaining the flow of supplies that enabled the Allies to maintain pressure on Axis forces across Europe and beyond. In the vast, turbulent waters of the Atlantic, ordinary men had risen to extraordinary challenges, ensuring that survival, supply, and victory traveled together across the hidden highways of the sea. The winter of 1944 brought new trials to the Atlantic convoys. Freezing temperatures and treacherous storms combined with persistent U-boat activity to create an almost unrelenting crucible. Ice-coated decks and violent swells tested both ships and crews, while the cold seeped into bones and machinery alike. Despite the brutal environment, sailors pressed onward, guided by the knowledge that every successful voyage kept armies supplied and civilians alive. Each crossing became a testament to endurance, resilience, and the quiet heroism of men confronting a world of water, steel, and hidden threats. Convoy tactics had grown increasingly sophisticated. Long-range air cover reduced the vulnerability of vessels in the mid-Atlantic gap, while new escort strategies provided overlapping layers of protection. Merchant ships adopted precise formations and synchronized maneuvers, blending discipline with improvisation. Radar and sonar improvements allowed escorts to detect submarines at greater distances, forcing the enemy to adopt riskier, less effective approaches. Yet technology alone was not enough. Success depended on the skill, intuition, and coordination of the crews who operated these machines under relentless stress. The men aboard merchant ships demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Engine rooms became theaters of improvisation, as crews repaired frozen pipes, jury-rigged damaged engines, and maintained speed against wind and current. Deckhands braved ice-laden decks to secure cargo and maintain rigging, often risking life and limb to prevent disaster. In moments of attack, these same sailors manned guns, assisted in rescue operations, and coordinated damage control, blurring the line between civilian labor and military duty. Heroism on these ships was not measured in headlines, but in the quiet acts of bravery that kept convoys intact and supplies moving. Naval escorts, their crews hardened by years of patrol, acted with precision and tenacity. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates engaged in calculated hunts for U-boats, their sonar operators detecting faint echoes, gunners readying weapons, and captains issuing split-second commands. Nighttime attacks demanded heightened alertness, with darkness concealing both enemy and ally. The tension was constant, yet discipline and training enabled successful defense of convoys, turning fear into controlled action. These escorts became lifelines, their vigilance and expertise ensuring that merchant sailors could complete missions that were critical to the war effort. The human element remained central to every crossing. Fear, fatigue, and isolation were constant companions, yet camaraderie and shared purpose created resilience. Sailors relied on one another for physical support and emotional sustenance, forming bonds that were as vital as any weapon or technology. Letters from home, brief port visits, and the shared triumph of surviving storms and attacks reinforced morale, reminding men of the broader significance of their perilous work. The psychological endurance of these crews was as crucial as their technical skill in sustaining the lifeline across the Atlantic. Every convoy carried cargo with profound strategic impact. Ammunition, vehicles, fuel, and food enabled operations on multiple fronts, influencing the success of battles and the survival of nations. The loss of a single ship could cascade into shortages, delayed offensives, and civilian suffering. Sailors understood that their vigilance, skill, and determination directly affected global outcomes. Each successful arrival reinforced the importance of their mission, emphasizing that heroism existed not only in combat, but in the steadfast perseverance required to ensure the flow of supplies. Weather and enemy action combined to create a relentless environment of challenge and danger. Gale-force winds and icy waves tested every ship, while U-boats and mines remained ever-present threats. Sailors adapted continuously, improvising repairs, adjusting formations, and maintaining alertness around the clock. Survival depended on teamwork, skill, and the willingness to confront the unexpected. In this theater, courage was measured not in moments of glory but in enduring hardship, maintaining composure, and ensuring that vital supplies reached their destination against all odds. By the end of 1944, the Atlantic convoy system had matured into a formidable, resilient network. Coordination, innovation, and human endurance had transformed perilous crossings into increasingly reliable operations. Merchant sailors, naval escorts, and support crews had endured unimaginable hardship, yet their efforts kept the flow of supplies constant and critical campaigns viable. In the hidden battles of the Atlantic, where courage, skill, and determination triumphed over stealth, storms, and relentless danger, the fate of nations rested on the steadfast bravery of those who sailed these secret highways, sustaining hope and survival across the vast ocean. The early months of 1945 brought a sense of urgency to the Atlantic convoys. As the war in Europe approached its climax, the need for supplies intensified and the margin for error narrowed. Convoys were larger, carrying heavier loads of munitions, vehicles, and essential foodstuffs. The crews, many seasoned by years of crossing the Atlantic, understood that their missions were not just routine deliveries but pivotal contributions to the final offensives against Nazi Germany. Each voyage was a calculated gamble, where success could accelerate victory and failure could delay it. Submarine threats persisted, though Allied technological advances and intelligence gains had begun to turn the tide. U-boats faced increasingly effective countermeasures. Long-range patrol aircraft, radar-equipped escorts, and strategic routing based on decrypted communications. Yet German commanders still sought opportunities, exploiting poor weather, nightfall, or mechanical failures to strike at convoys. Sailors remained vigilant, aware that complacency could be fatal. Each day demanded alertness, adaptability, and the seamless coordination of every crew member across hundreds of miles of open sea. The human element of endurance reached its peak in these final months. Sailors, having faced storms, torpedoes, and isolation for years, had become experts in both technical skill and psychological resilience. They repaired engines under duress, manned guns during sudden attacks, and maintained cargo integrity in turbulent waters. Their shared experiences forged a deep sense of camaraderie, a reliance on each other that became a lifeline in itself. In the Atlantic's unforgiving expanse, trust and teamwork were as vital as maps, compasses, and radar. Escort vessels continued to play a decisive role. Destroyers, frigates, and corvettes operated in close coordination, protecting merchant ships from both visible and hidden threats. Their crews worked tirelessly, scanning the horizon, tracking sonar contacts, and preparing for rapid engagement. Each encounter required split-second decision-making, balancing offensive and defensive priorities while maintaining formation integrity. The precision and discipline of these naval crews provided the backbone for the convoy system, transforming vulnerable cargo vessels into part of an effective and resilient fighting network. The Atlantic storms remained relentless, testing the limits of ship and sailor alike. Waves towered over decks, icy winds lashed exposed faces, and cargo shifted perilously in the hold. Sailors endured hours of exhausting labor, securing cargo, monitoring engines, and keeping watch for threats. Survival required not just physical strength, but adaptability, experience, and mental fortitude. The ocean demanded constant respect, and those who sailed it learned to anticipate its moods, adapting their actions to the ever-changing challenges of wind, wave, and cold. Coordination and communication were critical in these high-stakes voyages. Visual signals, semaphore, and prearranged codes allowed convoys to maintain formation while minimizing exposure to enemy interception. Every command, every maneuver required clarity, precision, and discipline. The success of a convoy often depended on the flawless execution of these signals under pressure, with missteps potentially leading to disaster. Sailors and officers developed an intuitive understanding of each other's movements, forming a silent language of trust and timing that proved essential in the deadly theater of the Atlantic. Each successful crossing was a triumph of human endurance and strategic planning. Cargo delivered enabled frontline operations, sustained civilian populations, and reinforced the Allied war effort. The significance of these deliveries went beyond material value. They represented hope, continuity, and the unbroken will of nations to persevere. Sailors understood that their labor, often unheralded, was crucial in determining the outcome of campaigns. Every port reached safely became a quiet but profound victory, a testament to the skill, bravery, and resilience of those who navigated these hidden highways of the sea. By spring 1945, the Atlantic convoys had proven indispensable to Allied success. They had evolved from vulnerable supply lines into highly coordinated, resilient operations, capable of countering both human and environmental threats. Merchant sailors, naval escorts, and support personnel had transformed adversity into expertise, ensuring that essential supplies reached their destinations despite the ocean's perils and enemy aggression. In the shadows of history, these secret convoys embodied courage, perseverance, and the unyielding spirit of those who sailed them, sustaining hope and survival across the vast, unforgiving Atlantic. As 1945 progressed, the Atlantic convoys took on an almost mythic significance, representing the culmination of years of struggle, ingenuity, and sacrifice. The war on land was reaching its final phases, yet the flow of supplies across the ocean remained vital. Tanks, artillery, ammunition, and food were lifelines to the soldiers advancing through Europe. Every crossing carried immense stakes, A delay could ripple across battlefronts, affecting operations and survival alike. Sailors, seasoned by years of peril, understood the weight of responsibility they bore and faced the ocean with an extraordinary blend of courage, precision, and quiet resolve. The German U-boat threat, while diminished by Allied technological advances, remained unpredictable and dangerous. Wolfpacks occasionally still found openings, exploiting poor weather or mechanical failures. Merchant crews had learned to adapt, coordinating with escorts, adjusting routes, and anticipating attacks. Even minor errors could have deadly consequences, and the psychological strain of constant vigilance never fully abated. Yet through experience and resilience, sailors transformed fear into disciplined action, responding to threats with a level of instinctive coordination that was the result of years of intense, life-or-death training. Escort vessels had become highly sophisticated instruments of protection. Destroyers and corvettes operated with precise timing, scanning the water with sonar and radar, deploying depth charges, and providing immediate support to merchant ships under attack. Coordination among escorts was crucial, balancing defense and offense while maintaining formation. Night attacks required heightened attention and split-second decision-making, with darkness concealing both danger and opportunity. The presence of skilled escorts instilled confidence in merchant sailors, creating a symbiosis where trust, vigilance, and expertise ensured that cargo reached its destination despite ever-present risks. The human factor remained central to every crossing. Sailors endured extreme cold, freezing winds, and the constant motion of storm-tossed ships. Sleep was fleeting, and the monotony of the endless Atlantic waves tested mental endurance. Yet camaraderie, shared experience, and the understanding of the larger purpose infused the crew with resilience. Every repair in the engine room, every maneuver on deck, and every watch taken in frigid isolation contributed to the survival of the convoy. Heroism was found not only in combat, but in the steadfast performance of these relentless, unseen duties. Cargo was more than material. It was hope, sustenance, and strategic leverage. Food kept civilians alive in bombed-out cities, fuel-powered armored offensives, and ammunition enabled critical battles. The loss of a single vessel could disrupt operations, delay advances, and cost lives. Sailors carried this awareness, and each successful voyage reinforced their sense of purpose. The quiet triumphs of delivering supplies intact were victories that, while unseen in the broader narratives of war, were essential to the ultimate success of the Allied campaigns. Weather, the ever-present adversary, demanded constant vigilance. Storms could scatter convoys, shift cargo, or damage hulls beyond repair. Ice coated decks and rigging, creating hazards that could claim lives even in the absence of enemy action. Sailors adapted continuously, using experience, ingenuity, and endurance to navigate these treacherous conditions. The Atlantic demanded not only skill but psychological fortitude, transforming ordinary crews into resilient, capable teams able to confront the unpredictable might of both nature and war. Communication, subtle and precise, remained critical. Visual signals, semaphore, and prearranged codes ensured coordination while limiting the risk of interception. Each command had to be executed flawlessly. A delayed or misinterpreted signal could scatter ships, expose vulnerabilities, or invite disaster. Captains, officers, and crews developed a near-intuitive understanding of one another, creating a silent language of trust that allowed convoys to operate with remarkable cohesion despite the chaos of storms and attacks. Discipline, timing, and cooperation became as vital as the ships themselves in ensuring survival. By the spring of 1945, the Atlantic convoys had become an enduring symbol of strategic, technological, and human achievement. Merchant sailors and naval escorts, having endured years of extreme danger, now navigated with confidence born of experience. Every ton of cargo delivered had helped shape the final campaigns of the war, sustaining both armies and civilians. In these secret, perilous journeys across the ocean, the ordinary courage of sailors became extraordinary, proving that victory depended as much on endurance, coordination, and resilience at sea as on the battles fought on land and in the air. As the war in Europe moved toward its final collapse, The convoys entering the Atlantic in early 1945 carried a sense of anticipation unlike anything seen in prior years. Sailors felt the shift. Radio reports suggested German forces were retreating, cities were falling, and Allied units were closing in on Berlin. Yet even as hope grew, the crews understood that danger rarely faded quietly. The Atlantic had taught them that the last chapter of a struggle was often just as perilous as the first. With this awareness, they braced themselves for crossings that might still demand everything they had. The U-boats, now fewer in number and plagued by fuel shortages and failing morale, remained unpredictable foes. Some commanders, desperate to inflict final damage, launched reckless attacks that made them more dangerous despite their diminishing numbers. German submarines often operated alone by this stage, lacking the coordinated wolfpack tactics of earlier years, but unpredictability itself became a threat. A single torpedo, launched at the right moment, could still claim a vital ship. Merchant sailors, sensing the enemy's cornered aggression, heightened their vigilance, even as victory drew close. Allied escorts, now experienced and well-equipped, handled these late-war threats with remarkable efficiency. Ships carried improved sonar, faster depth-charge launchers, and refined radar systems capable of detecting even subtle movements beneath the waves. Escort commanders had honed their tactics through thousands of miles of combat. When contact was detected, escorts moved with practiced precision, coordinating maneuvers that reflected years of hard-earned expertise. Each successful defense reaffirmed that the once-feared U-boat menace had been decisively turned by determination and technological evolution. Amid the technical and tactical developments, the human experience remained at the heart of every crossing. Many sailors had been at sea for years, some since the earliest convoys of 1941 and 1942. Their faces showed the endurance of countless storms, tense nights, and frozen decks. Yet underneath the fatigue was a shared pride, a quiet acknowledgement that they had helped sustain entire nations across an ocean defined by relentless danger. Their stories, often undocumented, reflected a rare blend of resilience and humility. The cargo they transported in these final months took on symbolic weight. Supplies now supported not only the advancing front lines, but also liberated towns and cities struggling to rebuild after years of devastation. Food, medical supplies, portable machinery, and fuel helped restore order and stability across a continent scarred by conflict. Each crate, barrel, and container represented a small part of the world's recovery, living proof that the convoys were not just military operations, but humanitarian lifelines. Nature, as always, remained impartial to human conflict. Even late in the war, storms swept across the Atlantic with an almost theatrical fury, as if reminding sailors that the sea itself was indifferent to victory or defeat. Giant waves slammed against hulls, winds howled through rigging, and icy spray froze on metal surfaces. The crews battled through it all with the same determination that had carried them through the darkest years of the war. Their survival in these conditions was a testament not only to engineering and training, but to an unspoken, deeply rooted resolve. Communication grew more precise as technology and discipline converged. Convoys relied on strategic radio silence, using prearranged visual signals and coded flashes of light across the dark waters. Every vessel, from the lead escort to the last merchant ship, followed an intricate choreography. Officers studied the timing of each maneuver until it felt like second nature. That silent coordination, hundreds of sailors working in unison across dozens of ships, became one of the Atlantic campaign's most remarkable accomplishments. By the end of early spring 1945, as the Allies prepared for the final push into Central Europe, the convoys reflected the culmination of years of perseverance. The once vulnerable merchant fleets were now symbols of strength and unity, supported by formidable escorts and guided by seasoned crews. The war had reshaped technology, strategy, and above all, the people who sailed these routes. Their bravery, often overshadowed by battlefield victories, stood as one of the defining pillars of the Allied triumph. The beating heart of the Atlantic convoys, the human courage behind the machinery, had helped turn the tide of history. As the war approached its final weeks, the convoys entering the North Atlantic found themselves navigating a strange mixture of danger and anticipation. The bitter cold still lashed the decks, and the long winter nights continued to cloak the sea in darkness. But word filtered through. Cities were falling one after another. German units were collapsing, and Allied forces were pushing deeper into a crumbling Reich. Merchant sailors listened quietly to these reports, understanding that while victory might be close, the Atlantic would remain as merciless as ever until the last hostile submarine was silenced. No one aboard believed the ocean cared about the fate of nations. The U-boat arm, battered and exhausted, made a series of desperate final attempts to disrupt the flow of supplies. Commanders, aware that Germany's defeat was imminent, were still under orders to strike whenever possible. Some crews, young and inexperienced replacements, ventured out with only a fraction of the training their predecessors had once received. Others were veterans who refused to surrender, hoping for one last successful attack. These encounters were chaotic and unpredictable, reflecting the disintegration of German command structures on land and sea. One torpedo could still change the fate of a convoy, so Allied ships remained poised for sudden action. Allied escort vessels, hardened by years of relentless combat, responded with a level of confidence unimaginable in the dark days of 1942. Their sonar operators could distinguish between submarine shadows, whales, and wreckage with almost uncanny precision. Radar screens glowed with clarity even in heavy storms, guiding escorts through low-visibility waters. Crews moved with disciplined efficiency, depth charges armed, hedgehog projectors ready, lookout teams vigilant despite freezing winds. The Atlantic battle had become a brutally efficient science, mastered through sacrifice and innovation. Still, the late-war convoy missions were not purely tactical endeavors. Each ship carried men who had spent years living at sea, their hands calloused from rope and steel, their faces aged far beyond their years. Many had lost friends in earlier crossings, or had survived devastating torpedo attacks that still haunted their thoughts. Even as the war's end neared, every crack of ice against the hull, every flicker on the radar, every distant mechanical noise at night triggered memories of explosions, rushing water, and frantic escapes. Their courage was not fearless. It was the resilience of those who had learned to survive fear itself. The cargoes of these final convoys reflected the shifting priorities of a world preparing for peace. Instead of purely military material, ships now transported relief supplies, flour for starving cities, medical kits for hospitals overwhelmed by the wounded, fuel for power plants, and agricultural equipment for farmers returning to fields long abandoned. The cargo holds symbolized both destruction and renewal, carrying the tools needed to rebuild societies shattered by 6 years of conflict. These missions revealed the convoy's broader purpose. They were not only engines of war, but bridges to recovery. Yet the Atlantic remained a formidable adversary. Storm fronts swept down with little warning, battering ships with towering waves. Icebergs drifted south from Greenland, their pale forms emerging like ghostly mountains in the fog. Navigation required constant recalibration, and engineers toiled below deck to keep engines running as freezing waters tried to choke machinery. The sea reminded everyone that survival depended on endurance as much as enemy action, and that nature had shaped the fate of nations as powerfully as any admiral or general. Convoy discipline, refined through countless miles of practice, became a near art form. Ships maintained precise spacing, adjusting speed and bearing with quiet synchronization. Signal lamps flashed coded messages that only practiced eyes could interpret. Even small errors, a ship straying out of position, a misread signal, could create openings for lurking U-boats. The ability of dozens of ships to move as a unified whole across thousands of miles of ocean was one of the Allied war effort's most extraordinary achievements, reflecting coordination on a scale rarely seen in naval history. By April 1945, the convoys sailing toward Europe felt the momentum of war shifting beneath their hulls. They were delivering not only supplies, but also the weight of history. Every voyage completed, every cargo safely unloaded, symbolized the unraveling of Hitler's ambitions. The merchant marine and their escorts had helped prevent famine, sustained armies, bolstered industries, and maintained the connections that enabled the Allied coalition to function. Their work, largely unseen by the public, proved indispensable to victory. As the Atlantic's winds swept across the decks of the final wartime convoys, the sailors understood that they had not merely survived a battlefield, they had carried a civilization across the ocean. By the spring of 1945, the convoys crossing the Atlantic embodied the final act of a long and brutal struggle. Though the waters had begun to quiet in terms of enemy activity, every sailor knew from experience that the last days of any war were never peaceful. The ocean still felt haunted by the ghosts of ships lost in previous years, names etched into memory but swallowed by the deep. Merchant sailors walked the decks with a cautious optimism, sensing that the ordeal was nearing its end while refusing to trust the Atlantic's unpredictable temperament. Victory might be close, but the price of complacency had always been measured in lives. The German U-boat fleet was collapsing under the weight of Allied superiority, yet pockets of resistance remained. Some submarines operated far from home, unaware that their bases had been destroyed or overrun. Others received orders that no longer reflected reality, commands issued by a fractured military hierarchy clinging to the illusion of strategic coherence. These isolated U-boats, cut off and desperate, became wild cards in the dying days of the Atlantic campaign. Their commanders acted unpredictably, launching attacks that were often more symbolic than strategic, driven by loyalty, denial, or fatalism. This unpredictability kept the convoys on edge even as the broader threat faded. When these final submarines revealed themselves, the confrontations showcased just how dramatically the balance had shifted. Allied escorts reacted with seamless coordination, closing on sonar contacts with practiced speed, boxing in enemy submarines with maneuvers perfected over years of hard fighting. Hedgehog mortars and advanced depth charge arrays delivered overwhelming force with near-clinical precision. The Atlantic battlefield, once tilted decisively toward the hunters of the deep, now favored the defenders of the convoy lanes by a margin that would have been unimaginable in 1941 or 1942. Each destroyed U-boat represented the closing of a chapter that had defined the very soul of the war at sea. Even with the tactical picture improving, the daily grind of convoy life remained unchanged. The watches continued, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, repeating endlessly. Bosuns checked rigging that had been battered by winds stronger than any artillery barrage. Stewards prepared meals in galley kitchens that lurched violently with every swell. Radio operators sat in cramped compartments, listening for coded signals while the ship groaned around them. It was a form of endurance rarely celebrated in headlines, yet essential to keeping the lifeline between continents open. The heroism here was quiet, persistent, and sustained across unimaginable distances. At the same time, the convoys began to carry an emotional weight that had grown heavier with every passing month. Many sailors had left home in the early days of the war, promising families they would return before too long. Years later, those promises felt both distant and immediate. They had become men shaped by storms, torpedo warnings, and the constant thrum of engines pushing across a hostile ocean. Photographs tucked into jacket pockets had faded from salt air, but the faces still guided them. The thought of stepping back onto a quiet street or a familiar front porch felt surreal, almost more intimidating than facing the vast Atlantic's rage. Cargo manifests reflected the approaching end of conflict. Tanks and ammunition still sailed east, but now they shared space with crates of medical supplies, refugee aid packages, spare parts for rebuilding factories, and even children's clothing. This shift underscored a profound transformation. The convoys were no longer only a war machine feeding distant front lines. They were now threads weaving together the fabric of a future peace. Supplies intended for devastated civilians reminded every sailor of why they endured the Atlantic's dangers for so long. They were helping rebuild a world that had nearly consumed itself. Even as the physical danger diminished, the emotional strain on sailors intensified. Rumors circulated. The Germans were near surrender. Hitler was rumored dead. Allied troops had reached the Elbe. But rumors were a fragile source of comfort. A sudden storm could still cripple a ship. A solitary U-boat could still strike before disappearing beneath the waves. The men lived in a liminal state, caught between a war not yet concluded and a peace they could almost taste. It was this emotional tightrope that defined the final crossings, each day a reminder of both imminent victory and the persistent demands of survival. By late April, the convoys pushing eastward sensed the Atlantic campaigns and drawing near, but none could yet see the final page turning. The sea remained vast, untamed, and indifferent. The ships pressed forward, their bow waves cutting through waters that had once been battlefields and now felt strangely calm. The sailors stood watch with the same discipline that had carried them through the darkest years, aware that the legacy of their journey extended far beyond the cargo in their holds. They had kept nations alive, literally, and safeguarded the unity of an alliance that would soon reshape the world. Even as Europe's war reached its final hour, the convoys remained the silent, steadfast arteries of victory. As May 1945 approached, the convoys moving across the Atlantic felt the tremors of a world in transition. The radio messages crackling through the ships were unlike any they had heard before. Fragmented reports of German units surrendering, cities liberated, and the Reich collapsing with breathtaking speed. Yet despite these signals of an ending, the sailors refused to relax. No one aboard forgot that the ocean had claimed ships even on calm, ordinary days. War might be closing elsewhere, but out on the open Atlantic, the timeless duel between sailor, sea, and unseen enemy continued with the same unyielding tension. The remaining German submarines represented the last flickers of a force that had once terrorized the world's oceans. Their numbers were small, but their desperation made them unpredictable. Some U-boats, cut off from command, acted independently, striking simply because it was all they had left. Others roamed the sea unaware that their government was on the verge of collapse. A few attempted suicidal attacks, hoping to damage Allied supply routes in a final gesture of defiance. Each encounter underscored how the Atlantic War, though all but won, could still take its toll in the final hours. For the escorts guarding the convoys, these late clashes felt like echoes of earlier, harder years. The ships deployed their weapons with near-flawless precision, a reflection of how dramatically the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted. No longer the overextended, under-equipped guardians of 1941, the escort groups now operated with unmatched confidence, guided by well-drilled crews and advanced detection technology. These men understood the symbolic weight of every safe crossing. They were delivering the last loads of a war that had cost millions of lives, carrying material that would cement the defeat of a regime built on brutality and conquest. Despite these remaining dangers, there was a new tone aboard the merchant vessels, hope mingled with exhaustion. Men spoke quietly about what they would do when they returned home, sometimes in fragments, as if afraid saying it aloud might invite misfortune. Some hadn't seen their families in years. Others had children who had learned to walk and talk without them. The Atlantic had reshaped their identities, carving into them a deeper sense of patience and perspective. The idea of stepping off the gangplank into a peaceful world felt like a distant dream that might soon, impossibly, become real. The final eastbound shipments carried supplies that revealed the scale of the continent's needs. There were emergency rations for liberated populations, medical equipment for overwhelmed field hospitals, steel and machinery for rebuilding factories, and fuel for cities emerging from darkness. Even luxury items like coffee, chocolate, and canned fruit appeared in some manifests, symbols of normal life, returning slowly after years of deprivation. These convoys were no longer feeding only armies. They were feeding hope itself, bringing the materials needed to restore humanity after a conflict that had scarred continents. Nature continued to exert its indifferent power over these crossings. Spring storms swept across the Atlantic, hammering decks with rain and slamming ships with walls of water. Fog banks drifted in suddenly, swallowing convoys in dense whiteness and forcing vessels to follow their escorts by sound and instinct. Icy winds reminded the crew that the ocean obeyed no timetable but its own. The sailors learned that peacetime would not soften the Atlantic. Their struggle against nature had always been separate from the ambitions of nations. On the bridges of these ships, officers studied charts with a growing sense of reverence. They had crossed these waters so many times that the routes felt like familiar trails through a wilderness of waves. Every latitude and longitude held memories, places where ships had been lost, where escorts had fought, where storms had battered them. These coordinates, mapped with the blood and endurance of countless sailors, would one day be remembered not only as battlegrounds, but as symbols of persistence on a scale rarely acknowledged. When news finally arrived that Germany had surrendered, the message traveled ship to ship in silence at first, radiomen whispering to captains, captains walking onto the bridge to stare out at the rolling sea. There was no triumphant roar across the waves, only a quiet, reverent stillness. The convoys kept steaming because the ocean cared nothing for the end of a war. But inside every sailor, a shift occurred, a release of tension held so long it had become part of their identity. They continued forward not as combatants completing a mission but as witnesses to history, bearing the weight of a victory earned through endurance, sacrifice, and the courage to cross an unforgiving ocean again and again. As the guns of Europe fell silent and the Reich capitulated, the convoys still moving across the Atlantic found themselves sailing into a world that had fundamentally changed. The sea looked no different, the same rolling gray expanse, the same cold wind, the same stubborn swells, but the purpose behind every mile now felt transformed. These ships were no longer racing to supply armies locked in a desperate global struggle. They were now carrying the seeds of rebuilding, stitching together a world attempting to emerge from the shadows of ruin. The sailors sensed this shift even before they saw the headlines, feeling it in the calmness of the escorts and the absence of that familiar electric tension that had once accompanied every sonar ping. Ports that had once been militarized fortresses now erupted with crowds welcoming the ships as symbols of survival and resilience. In Liverpool, Glasgow, and Belfast, civilians gathered along the docks to watch the merchant vessels glide into harbor, their hulls scarred by storms and war, but still standing proud. Longshoremen cheered the crews who had kept Britain supplied through its darkest nights, while relief workers mobilized to unload crates destined for liberated cities. The convoys became processions of hope, marking the return of a world able to breathe again. After years of blackout curtains and ration lines, these arrivals represented life reawakening. For the sailors, the end of the war brought a complicated mix of relief, grief, and reflection. Many had lost friends to torpedoes, storms, or fiery explosions that had swallowed entire ships in moments. Victory did not erase those memories, it made them sharper. Standing on deck in the quiet hours of morning, men found themselves thinking not of triumph, but of the empty bunks, the faces missing from the mess hall, the names never crossed off the casualty lists. Their victory had been earned through sacrifice measured not in battles won, but in every successful voyage that delivered food, fuel, and ammunition across the world's most dangerous ocean. As convoys transitioned into peacetime operations, the ships faced the daunting task of helping rebuild nations shattered by years of devastation. They carried lumber for new homes, machinery for quieted factories, medicines for hospitals overflowing with wounded civilians, and supplies for schools reopening in bombed-out neighborhoods. They transported displaced people seeking to return home and humanitarian workers fanning out across Europe. In many ways, the merchant marine became the first great engine of the post-war world, transforming from an artery of war into a lifeline of reconstruction. The Atlantic lanes, once fields of battle, evolved into the highways of recovery. Yet even in peace, the sea demanded respect. Storms still battered hulls, and mechanical failures still threatened journeys. Without the pressure of wartime urgency, repairs could finally be made properly, and exhausted ships could rest in dry dock after years of relentless deployments. Sailors who had grown accustomed to constant danger found themselves adjusting to a quieter routine, one marked by regular sleep, steady schedules, and the knowledge that a sonar contact was no longer a prelude to life or death decisions. The stillness felt unfamiliar, but it was a stillness they had earned with every harrowing mile they had traveled. Back home, the public began to grasp the true magnitude of the merchant marine's contribution. Newspapers published stories of convoys that had braved iceberg fields, enemy submarines, and monstrous storms. Veterans returned to small towns and big cities with stories that often left listeners stunned, for their battles had been fought far from the headlines. Without fanfare or parades, these men had endured the longest, most unforgiving front of the war. Historians later wrote that if soldiers had marched across Europe, It was because merchant sailors had carried the world on their shoulders across the sea. In the decades that followed, the names of the convoys, HX, ON, SC, PQ, became chapters in the larger story of the war's victory. Maritime museums collected logbooks and photographs, honoring the men whose courage had sustained entire nations. Memorials rose near ports where sailors had once embarked on journeys they knew might be their last. Families visited these monuments, tracing the carved names of loved ones who had vanished into the deep. The war at sea remained one of the conflict's most demanding campaigns, defined not by grand offensives but by the quiet, persistent heroism of those who faced the Atlantic day after day. And so the story of the secret convoys concluded not with a single triumphant moment, but with the enduring legacy of their service. They had crossed the ocean under fire, under storms, under the weight of a world depending on them. They had turned the tide when the world hung in the balance, and afterward, they had carried the tools of peace to lands desperate for renewal. Long after the guns fell silent, the convoys remained symbols of determination, proof that victory is not won solely on the battlefield, but also in the steady movement of ships slicing through dark seas toward a better future. Their legacy lives wherever nations thrive because lifelines once held fast across the Atlantic, guided by sailors whose courage never faltered.